Hello, hi, and welcome to Born Loved. This is a week of talks inviting every student in Oxford University to explore their identity and to discover the identity that Jesus has to offer. My name is Emma, and I'm your host for this lunchtime. I'm really sorry to say that John Lennox, who was advertised for this event, is unable to be with us today because he's unwell, but instead we're really lucky to be joined by Ard Louis. The lunchtime talks address common objections to the Christian faith, and today Ard will be speaking with the title, Has Science Buried God? Ard will speak for half an hour, and after that we'll have a short break, when those of you with commitments at 2 will be free to leave. During that time, a number will go up on the screens, to which you can text any questions you have concerning the talk. Then we'll have a short time of question and answer before wrapping things up at 2 p.m. So I'd love to invite Ard up now. He's a director of graduate studies in theoretical physics here in Oxford, where he also leads a research group studying problems on the border between chemistry, physics, and biology. Over to you.
Thank you very much. So it's a great pleasure for me to be here with you. Can you hear me okay? Oh, good. It's better. So I'm Ard Louis. I'm a theoretical physicist. And what I want to tell you about is one of the great loves of my life, which is science. And I want to connect that to the greatest love in my life, which is God. And I want to tell you a bit how those things connect together. And so, oops. Have the next slide, please. I'm having a little problem with my, just check my little thing is plugged in. Right, great. So, what I want to tell you about is one of the most exciting things I ever learned when I was an undergraduate. So, when I was in secondary school in the Netherlands, I taught myself quantum mechanics, but just basic quantum mechanics. And I thought that is really one of the most beautiful things that I've ever seen. It explains exactly how really small things work, how it explains all of chemistry in principle, and it explains a lot of what makes us alive. And that was all actually worked out in 1926 by Erwin Schrödinger, a very famous Austrian physicist. And just a few years later, Paul Dirac in Cambridge was thinking about another version of this question, thinking, what about really small things that go very, very fast? So you're probably all familiar with the theory of special relativity, things that go very fast. A few of you will have had that already in your first year. And what happens if something small goes very fast? How do you make the Schrödinger equation Lorentz invariant, is really the question he was asking. And he tried that for the electron, and as you probably know, the electron has spin up and spin down. And what's amazing about these equations that you see on this little slide is if you take the electron with spin up and spin down and you want to make it transform according to the laws of quantum mechanics, the laws of very small things, and the laws of special relativity, Einstein's special relativity, things that go very fast, the only way you can mathematically solve that is by having another object. And Dirac was a great genius. And he said, well, if that's what the mathematics tells us, that must be true. And just a few years later, it was actually discovered, if we put the next slide, that what he discovered, that other component, was the positron. It's a piece of antimatter. You probably are familiar now with PET scans, positron tomography, PET scans. But that was discovered not initially by somebody looking for these things, but by somebody just how mathematics must connect the theory of very small things and the theory of very fast things. I see a lot of glazed looks around, and you'll be happy to know that this will not be on the final exam at the end of today. Although I am writing some exams for you, so a few of you. But that won't be on it, just it's one little tip. And I remember as an undergraduate doing this derivation and thinking, how could there be a structure to the universe that takes two very disparate things, a theory of very small things, a theory of very fast things, puts them together, and something possibly even more amazing, more extraordinary comes out, namely antimatter. It's absolutely staggering. And I was sure that Dirac was wrong. I was sure that there was no way that that could be true. It's just too fantastic. It's too amazing. And I actually spent a whole night working on it, thinking about it, trying to figure out, how could you make this thing work without having antimatter? And it doesn't. It's a typical hubris of youth. You think that you might be able to overturn the great master. But I had to bow at the end of by the morning, and realize that it just didn't work. It's the only way the world works. This is what we physicists call the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. It's a gift, said the great physicist Eugene Wigner, nor deserve. And to me, this is unbelievably beautiful. I think it's one of the most beautiful things that you could ever see. I think it's more beautiful than the mountains you see, more beautiful than some of the most beautiful paintings. It's something. And so, in fact, I pinch myself sometimes that I get paid money to think about these kinds of things. In fact, if you were taxpayers, it'd be your money. I'd say thank you very much, but you're not. The great things, if I'd been born a generation or two ago, I would have had to be independently wealthy to spend my life thinking about these things. I get paid money to think about this. And I think it's absolutely spectacular. And so that's if you take anything away from today, anything at all, then I hope that you take this away, which is that nature is unbelievably beautiful, that science is unbelievably beautiful, and that you are incredibly privileged to study the things that you do here, to have the leisure to think about these things. Give you the next slide. So what I really want to talk about in some detail, if I can, points. The first question is, how do I, as a scientist, connect up with my Christian faith? Is that not a little bit like a vegetarian butcher? Somebody who says, I don't really do this stuff, but I'll sell it to you instead. Or is it something perhaps more sinister, like a pacifist soldier, somebody you can't really trust in the heat of the battle? And that is a common view in the world around us. I think it's sometimes linked to something which I'll talk about next, is the conflict metaphor, the idea that science and faith are primarily at conflict. Probably the thing that drew you to this meeting today. And I'm going to argue that this is a myth, by and large. And I hope one thing that we teach you here at this university is not to believe in myths. I hope that one thing that we teach you is to think hard and long about what is true and what's not true. And so I hope to help you with that. On the left of that slide, on the right of that slide, you see a bunch of faces. These are a bunch of my colleagues that we get together once or twice a year to run a course for postgrad students on thinking Christianly about your subject. And we have people that do history. They're all academics at this university. In fact, one of the interesting things about that course is that I run the science track. And I have a very large number of Christians in this university who teach in the sciences who like to teach on that track. The difficulty I actually have is sometimes managing all the people that want to speak. Whereas it's actually less people in the humanities or the social sciences. So interestingly, at least sociologically, you're most likely to find scientists in the science departments. In fact, probably those of you that are in science, certainly those of you in physics, quite a few of your lecturers be very keen Christians. That's where Christians in the sciences get together. Why do we think that there's not an issue? What is the kind of fundamental first point we might argue to you if you say to us, how can you be a scientist and a Christian? If I want to do the next slide. And I want to bring that up because here's another famous scientist from this university who said the following: there is no reason to expect that science cannot deal with any aspect of existence. And he goes further to say that really science can answer all the questions and that poetry and philosophy haven't really done anything at all. We'll leave that to the side for now. But the argument is that science, if it hasn't answered every question, will one day answer every question. And what we would often bring in as a contrast to that would be another great, next slide, another great physicist, another great scientist, Sir Peter Medawar, who won a Nobel Prize in medicine, who said that there is indeed a limit upon science can be made very likely by the existence of questions that science cannot answer, and that no conceivable advance of science would empower it to answer. These are the questions that children ask, the ultimate questions of Karl Popper, famous philosopher. I have in mind such questions as, how did everything begin? What are we all here for? And what is the point of living? It is not the science, therefore, but the metaphysics, imaginative literature, or religion that we must turn to answers to questions having to do with first and last things. And next slide. So what he said then is science is a great and glorious enterprise, the most successful, I argue, that human beings have ever engaged in. To reproach it for its inability to answer all of the questions that we'd like to put to it is no more sensible than to reproach a railway locomotive for not flying, or in general, not performing any other operation for which it was not designed. Next slide. So what is Peter Radovar really saying, these questions, and what would all of my colleagues say? I think it's best illustrated with this picture. Imagine one day you're walking a dark street in Oxford, and you come around the corner, and you see somebody there looking around on their hands and knees for a set of keys. And you ask them, so how could I help you? And they're looking around, and say, I can't find my keys, I'm looking. And so you spend a little while looking with them. After a while, you've more or less looked everywhere. And so you start to wonder, well, did they really lose their keys here? And you say, well, excuse me, where do you think you lost your keys? Well, the guy says, well, I think it's probably down at the end of the street is where I think I lost it when I jumped off my bike. But why are you looking here under the lamppost? You ask. And he says, well, the light is brighter here. An old joke. So, and the point that Sir Peter is making is this. Science is indeed a very bright light. It's a wonderful bright light. I'm very privileged to be a part of the scientific enterprise. But it only shines its bright light on very particular kinds of things. In fact, its power comes precisely from the kinds of limitations that it sets to itself. Testing things that are in some sense repeatable or testable in the laboratory. And there's only a very limited number of things that in fact have that character. And it's very dangerous, I think, to think that somehow science has no limits, and science will one day answer all those questions that are a little bit further out. It's just simply the human condition that many things in life are not answerable by the methods of science. The next slide, I'll give you one example. Let's say you want to ask the question, are you born loved? Or maybe another question, what is the value of a human life? That's an incredibly important question for society today. It's the basis of our human rights. Why do we think that humans have value? Well, the question is, could I answer those things with science? If I was a chemist, I could perhaps add up the value of the elements in your body, and if you have more gold fillings, you're worth more than someone less, but that seems very naive. If I was if you want to do the next one, if I was a physiologist, I might measure the size of your brain, or a psychologist, I might measure how smart you are, or an anthropologist, how the community values you, or an economist, I could measure the value that you have, economic value that you have. But every single one of those measures is incredibly limited, as I think you'll see. Instead, the question of where does the value of a human being come from, where does the value that you have comes from something else. And I'm not going to tell you where that comes from, but it doesn't come from science. It comes from faith, it comes from a wide range of things. It's dangerous to think that it only comes from science. When somebody tells you that it does come from science, they're usually engaging in one or two, what I might call simple fallacies. If you do the next one. Here's an example of a fallacy. You come into my home one day and you see a pot of water boiling on the stove. And you ask me, why is the water boiling? And I say, well, there's a heat source that is transforming thermal energy across the container wall into the liquid. This means that the mean square velocity of the molecules increases. The mean square velocity is proportional to the temperature. When that temperature reaches 100 degrees Celsius, there is a phase transition from a condensed phase to an expanded phase, which we call boiling. And that would be a reasonable answer on a thermodynamics test. But I could also say to you, you could ask me, why is the water boiling? And I would say to you, well, I fancy a cup of tea. Would you like one? And the important point is that just because I've just uncovered for you the mechanism by which something boils, doesn't mean that I've therefore exhausted the meaning. Because giving you a scientific understanding of how something might work, the mechanism, does not mean at all that I've therefore exhausted all the ways of thinking about it. And so when somebody does try to explain the way something works by having given you a scientific description and then saying that's all that there is, what they're engaged in, if you want to give me the next slide, is really something which we call nothing buttery. So let me give you another kind of crude example. This is something for the, let's say that you are, this is something for the men in the room. So it's a nice, beautiful restaurant, the lights are low, you're there with that special person, and she leans over and says, we've been together for a little while, and I just really want to know, do you really know who I am? Do you understand what I'm made of? And of course, you panic, because you realize this is a very dangerous question. If you get it wrong, you're going to be in trouble. And so, being a good scientist, you pick your brain and you say, well, I know what you're made of. Average human being is made of, if you want to give me a slide, enough phosphorus for 2,000 matches, enough iron for 1 nail, enough chlorine to disinfect the swimming pool, and enough fat for 10 bars of soap. At which point you're likely to get a slap. And of course, I'm making a bit of fun, but this is what we call nothing buttery. I have told you what you're made of, but and this is some advice, if you do try this tack and you use this kind of nothing buttery, it doesn't work, because there's a lot more to who we are, what it means to be human beings. So let me give you an illustration of what I mean by this question, is science the only way to reliable knowledge? So this is a friend of mine, Bill Newsom, who's a very famous professor of neuroscience in Stanford. One day, Bill was walking across the Stanford campus, and they saw this church, which is called the Memorial Church. It's a beautiful church in Stanford. And his colleague said, I don't see why we have a church on the campus. It's a monument to irrationality. I wish we'd just blow the thing up. Which Bill replied, well, in that case, perhaps we should blow up my home. It's also, in your view, a monument to irrationality. And what did Bill mean? Well, let me give you an example of the kinds of decisions that go into what makes a home. Let's say, take the example of getting married. So I'm married, which I highly recommend. But let's say that you would like to get married. That's probably true of quite a good number of you in this room. And so, is it true that you could either use a scientific way of deciding who to get married to, or is the only alternative irrationality? So is it science or irrationality? Are those the only two ways that are open to you? Well, a truly irrational thing would be to grab the first, the best woman you see and say, marry me. And if she says yes, that's even more irrational. What you do in practice is you get to know the person, you see whether you like each other. In fact, science can help a little bit. My wife and I did these compatibility tests. You have to look at where you squeeze the toothpaste and all that kind of stuff. It's very revealing. But in the end of the day, you don't marry somebody because you both score 95% on the compatibility test. There has to be a lot more to it. You ask people that you trust, people that you think are wise. What do you think of the two of you together? You ask your friends and all those kinds of things. But in the end of the day, I would never know what it's like to be married until I got married. And if I waited for scientific certainty, I would probably still be waiting on my own, very sad and lonely right now. Instead, what I had to do, what my wife had to do, was take a kind of step of faith and decide to get married. Because it's impossible to know what it's like to be married until you are married. And that is the case of a lot of truly important decisions in life. You can't subject them to repeatable experiments. Repeatable experiments in marriage is not a good way of getting a good marriage partner. It's actually not too dissimilar to the way that we might think about becoming a Christian. You would say, if you just blindly, irrationally choose without thinking about it, that is indeed irrational. Instead, what you do is you try to gain understanding. You think, does this make sense? Does it make intellectual sense? Is it rational? But comes a point at which you have to also make a step of faith. Because there are aspects to being a Christian which are only accessible to you after you have made that kind of decision. Just like there are aspects of what it's like to be married, most aspects in fact, which are only accessible to me after I'm married, and so I can't know them in advance. And so the argument I would make is that most important decisions in life have that character. Go to the next slide. So I want to contrast that with a kind of a caricature view of faith. Faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence. And that is so wrong, okay? That is just complete nonsense, because that's not the way we live our lives. It's true that if you make irrational steps toward, and just marry the first person that you see, that would be the kind of faith that Dawkins is talking about in this case. But that is not the kind of faith that Christians would have. That's when my colleagues and I are together, we talk about these things. It's not the kind of faith that we think that we have. It's something that makes sense of the world in a way that other ways of thinking, I think, don't. It's something that we've thought about, but it's also something which is we know from inside. And so that is maybe the main point that I want to get across to you in this short talk, is that most important decisions in life are not amenable to the scientific method. And if you live your life that way, you're going to live your life in an impoverished way. That doesn't mean that the alternative is somehow some kind of blind irrationality. Instead, the alternative is careful thinking. All right, so I have just a few minutes left, and I'm going to touch on one or two little ground-clearing exercises before we finish. Because I realize that all I've done here is sketch very, very briefly part of a much more complicated and long argument. So if you want to do the next slide, I'm going to sketch one thing. Next slide. Next slide. So I want to just touch on one thing, and I'm just going to quote authority rather than explain it to you in great detail. So there's a common view that historically science and faith have been at loggerheads, that somehow they've been fighting each other. I'm going to quote Peter Harrison, who was until recently professor of science and religion here in Oxford, who said, "Those who argue for the incompatibility of science and religion will draw little comfort from history. The myth of a perennial conflict with science and religion is one which no historian of science would subscribe." The next slide. And here's actually a book that came out a few years ago by 25 of the world's perhaps leading historians of science, who got so fed up with this conflict metaphor, this historical conflict metaphor, that they wrote a book trying to expose 25 of the most common myths of this thing. Now, of course, if you go to the next slide, the history of science, in fact, is a complicated one. It's not one just of science and faith connecting easily, but it is the case that science has deeply Christian roots. There are a lot of assumptions that we make in science. Assumptions like uniformity, the idea that if I do an experiment here in Oxford, if somebody does it in, say, Cambridge, at least if they're smart, they should get the same results because the rule is uniform. Those are historically ideas upon which science is based. You're so used to them now that you don't even realize that those are assumptions that you make. And the point is that those assumptions historically grew out of a theological understanding of a God who sustains the world, of a God who is a faithful God, and of an intelligence behind the universe. And so what you see, this is one of the many examples of where science has these deeply Christian roots. And you yourself are using those deeply Christian roots when you think about the natural world around you. Let me do the next slide. We see famously Isaac Newton. I'll skip to the next one because we want somebody local. Robert Boyle, from Boyle's Law, you walk down the high street, you can see a plaque in his honor, who was a deeply strong believer. In fact, many of the founders of the Royal Society were people of deep Christian faith. Just as today in this university, a pretty good number of scientists in this university are people of deep Christian faith. And the reasons are partially for the reasons that I just gave to you right now. And it's partially also because when we look at the world, when we look at something as beautiful, as unbelievably, stunningly beautiful, as the way that mathematics describes the world, it tells us something, it points in our minds towards a God behind this world. It points in our minds towards an intelligence behind this world. And I think that is why you find a lot more Christians in the sciences than you find in almost any other field of intellectual inquiry. Because in fact, on balance, I think the sciences point towards God rather than the other way. And that's the one thought I want to leave you with. I realize I've just barely touched on a number of complicated issues, but I want to leave you with that. And thank you very much.
And great. And so can we have the first question up, please? When science contradicts what Christians believe the Bible says, will Christian scientists ever believe it?
Sorry, I didn't realize I was going to come back up here, so there we go. Great. So that's a very good question. So the question is, if science were to contradict what Christians believe the Bible says, will Christian scientists ever believe it? And there already you see where the rub lies. So if there is actually an example, there are some examples in history where science did contradict what Christians believed the Bible said. And a very famous example is that some Christians believed that in fact many Christians believed that the earth was the center of the universe. And so when Copernicus and Galileo looked through their telescopes and saw planets moving they saw actually moons around Jupiter, for example, that indeed contradicted what Christians believed the Bible said. And the reason for that, but the question there is, why do they believe the Bible said? How do they interpret the Bible? And the reason why they thought the Bible said that the earth was the center of the universe had nothing to do with the Bible, but had to do with an importation of an Aristotelian cosmology, a Greek cosmology that had a very strong ideas about the earth, these spheres, and the heavenly spheres. And so what that science in fact did was helped Christians to rethink their interpretation of the Bible in light of what the Bible had originally meant to say. So that was actually a very helpful thing for Christians. So that's one example of where science seemed to contradict with the Bible, and in fact, in the end, helped Christians to understand the Bible better. And so really where that question of contradiction comes from is always, it's an interpretation of science and an interpretation of the Bible. Now, I don't think that there is, at the moment, anything in science that contradicts the Bible at all. And if somebody were to come up with something that contradicted the Bible, I would have to think very, very hard about whether my interpretation of the Bible was right or whether my interpretation of the science is right. Because I gave you one example where Christians had to revisit their views, and in fact it was helpful for them because it helped to cut some of the connections they had to a previous non-Christian worldview, a Greek worldview. And so that might be the case today, but it may also be the case, and I haven't given you examples of where science made very strong claims that were later shown to be true in the Bible. I'll give you one. If you read the first book of Genesis, there's a really fascinating aspect about the order in which things are described. The sun and the moon are not created until the fourth day. And the words for sun and moon that are used are not the words sun and moon, but rather words that mean something more like lamps, greater lamp and lesser lamp. Now that is kind of strange. Why would the writer do that? Well, think back to the time when these things were written down. What was the dominant science of the time? What was the university, the intelligentsia, if you wish, you can put it that way. They were astrologers. They believed that the sun and the moon were living beings that controlled our lives. The reason why the writer of Genesis puts the sun and the moon until the fourth day, which is very odd if you had morning and evening on the first, second, or third day. Why would you have the sun and the moon after the morning and evening? Why would you not call them sun and moon? Why would you call them lamps? Well, because the writer, inspired by God, was saying something very important. The sun and the moon are not living beings. They are physical objects like lamps. Therefore, do not worship them. That was a scientifically falsifiable statement that for most of our history as human beings, we would have thought was utter nonsense. It was really only the telescopes that were used, that were used by Galileo and Copernicus that showed us that, in fact, the sun and the moon were not living beings. And so that's an example of being the other way around. And so I think, hopefully, that's a long answer to a short question, but I think a very fascinating question.
Thank you. Next question. How could you explain the Big Bang Theory in biblical terms?
So the interesting thing is that the word Big Bang was coined by a very famous atheist, Sir Fred Hoyle. And he coined the word Big Bang because he had an alternative theory to the Big Bang called the steady state theory. And he didn't like the idea of a universe having a beginning, the Big Bang theory, which was in fact the great thinker. This was Georges Lemaitre, a Catholic cosmologist, a Catholic priest. And Hoyle didn't like this because he said a Big Bang suggests a beginning, and a beginning suggests a beginner. So already we see right there that the history of the word is in fact a history that was given to, a pejorative word given to it by someone who didn't like the theistic implications of the idea of a Big Bang. So the interesting about the Bible, what does the Bible say about the Big Bang? Well, the Bible actually doesn't say very much about the Big Bang. It just says about in the beginning, the universe was formless and void. The earth was formless and void. But it seems a lot more consistent with theism that there was a Big Bang, that something started at some point, than that the universe just would have always existed in a steady state, which was the alternative view by Hoyle. So on balance, it seems like something like a Big Bang is a lot more amenable to theism than a steady state theory would be.
Cool. I think we've got time for one more. Couldn't the fact that we find beauty in the laws of nature yield some evolutionary benefit, and therefore just be a byproduct of the evolutionary process?
So that's an interesting question. There's a lot of current discussion on this. Very famously, the philosopher Alvin Plantinga, who has his evolutionary argument against naturalism. And so the question isn't that whether... so here's the argument that I think many people would say is a fascinating one. If it were the case that our mental abilities evolved over time on the African plains in order to eat and not be eaten, in order to kill and not be killed, it would be highly unlikely that these same mental abilities would allow us to understand something like quantum mechanics and relativity, and certainly not non-commuting algebras, which is what you need to explain why you get antimatter. And so the main argument in the philosophical literature goes the other way around and says it's really hard to see, even if it was adaptive, why something adaptive like that would give us any true thing about the universe. Let me give you another example of that argument. Let's say that you think that we have evolved certain moral capacities, and that may be the case. We've evolved capacities for altruism. Whether that's true, whether that's the case or not, it would be highly surprising if those evolved capacities that allow you to survive, would in any way track with moral truths about the world. Things like it's wrong to kill innocent people. That would be Sharon Street's, a famous philosopher who's written on this. So it would be very highly surprising if these things track. On the other hand, the other way of thinking about it would be to say, if you are a theist, if you believe God created the world, then you would expect that if God used, for example, the mechanisms of history or the mechanisms of life, which I believe he did, we would expect those things to track reality. So we would expect, perhaps, to have a kind of rationality that would understand really deep and beautiful things about the universe. There's no reason why the universe should be beautiful. There's no reason why mathematics should be so unreasonably powerful. But it is. And so if you're a theist, and you start from assuming that there is a God, it resonates. It makes a lot of sense that it was not at all unexpected that the world would be that way. It's not at all unexpected that we would have rational capacity to understand some of the beautiful things about the world. If, on the other hand, you don't believe there's a God, if you're a naturalist and believe that that's all that there is, it would be extremely surprising if the basic mechanisms that allow survival at this primitive way would in any way also allow you to understand something about the way the world is. And it would be surprising that the world is beautiful. Why should that be? Right? So what actually happens is you can posit that it's that way, you can posit, but you end up getting a lot of things that you have to assume by faith, if you wish, if you want to understand why these things are true. Whereas the great thing about theism is that with just a few simple assumptions, you can explain a wide swathe of things, like the fact that we understand the beautiful world around us. It makes a lot more sense, a lot more coherent in a theistic point of view.
Great, thank you.